Sentence frames. Do they help English learners show what they know? What is action research? Action research allows teachers to study their own classrooms, their own instructional methods, their own students, and their own assessments. The purpose of my works in this action research study was to find an answer to the following question. What effect does the use of sentence frames have on elementary grade English learner students' abilities to correctly answer reading comprehension questions? I have many times seen my EL students struggle and become frustrated because even though they may understand the concepts that they are studying, they still lack the vocabulary to be able to express those concepts in written form. Researching this topic served to benefit me professionally, in that I wanted to find a modification that would enable my English learners to use written expression for communicating knowledge. So what does the data tell us about EL's performance in the writing domain? According to the writing samples, formative observations by instructors, and writing performance on standardized assessments, ELs are found to need support in the writing domain. When looking at my district's K-Prep results from 2016, there were 30.8% of elementary ELs that performed at writing proficient level, while 36.7% of the whole student population performed at writing proficient level. There were 40.6% of elementary ELs who performed at reading novice level, while 20% of the whole student body performed at this reading novice level. I wanted to look at reading and writing both because they are so interconnected. The modification that I studied is known as a sentence frame or as a closed sentence. I analyzed its contribution for giving writing support to ELs as they answer reading comprehension questions. What is a sentence frame? A sentence frame supplies the context and the functional language surrounding the key and missing vocabulary. And then all a student has to do is provide this key vocabulary. In preparation for my research, and in order to have a foundation to propel from, I studied past literature related to my research question. These are the highlights from my findings. The most increasing subpopulation for the grades of preschool through 12 is that of ELs or English learners. And teachers must be ready to inspire ELs through effective learning. This includes emphasizing academic vocabulary growth, literacy and content, and critical thinking skills. One should use structured language practice to provide students with opportunities to use language to think and talk and write about concepts that they are expected to comprehend. Sentence frames are a structured way to encourage students to use this academic language. Sentence frames are ready-made chunks of language that help language learners develop fluency and communicate concepts without getting over-involved in grammar rules. Students must comprehend these language functions surrounding the concepts if they are to understand those concepts. Some examples of these language functions are compare and contrast, summarize, state opinion, and cause and effect. The methodology for my research was an explanatory mixed method design, which consisted of the main focus of quantitative data as well as qualitative data, and the qualitative data was used for elaboration and further explanation of this main focus. And the quantitative data was actually 2 assessments that I compared, and the qualitative data consisted of field observation notes and my participant interview responses. The research was conducted at 3 different elementary schools. The participants completed the research activities either in a one-on-one or a small group context. There were 12 participants. They all were 2nd and 3rd graders. All these participants did demonstrate a need for support with writing, and the participants had received English instruction for 4.5 years or less. This slide demonstrates the languages other than English spoken by participants. 11 of the participants also spoke Spanish, and one participant also spoke Gujarati. This bar graph shows the number of years that the participants were enrolled in ESL and US schools. And as we look at the graph, we see that the least amount of time participants were enrolled was 2.5 years, and the most time that any of the participants were enrolled was 4.5 years. Now let's examine some reading and writing data for the participants. We are now looking at some access data for a participant. The access is the required English proficiency assessment that they must participate in annually. The access progresses in levels from 1 to 6, with 6 being considered fully English proficient. The access also progresses in tiers A through C, and as the tiers advance, the English on the assessment becomes more complex. So when we look at this particular participant, this is a second grade student, and we see that on the reading, which is on the left, they are close to a level 2, and on the writing, they are testing at a 2.5. And here we see the reading and writing levels according to access for the remainder of the participants. There were 4 participants who tested in the B tier, and then there were 6 participants who tested in the C tier. You'll see the reading levels on the left in the blue and the writing levels on the right in the red. This chart displays the participants' Fontes and Pinnell reading levels as well as the writing levels. As you can see, all the participants did fall below grade level with writing according to their teachers, except for one second grader. Although this second grader did show a need for support in writing on the Access English Proficiency Assessment. In order to gather quantitative data, participants read 2 different grade level prompts and responded in writing to comprehension questions. The first test required them to answer questions without the support of sentence frames. The second test also required them to answer comprehension questions, but did provide the sentence frames for language support. As the participants completed their activities, I recorded observation field notes regarding what I saw, heard, and perceived about the participants' actions and the environmental context. These notes also included my instructional reflections. These transcribed observations were then placed into a password-protected digital document. Participants were interviewed regarding their perceptions of taking the assessments both with and without the support of the sentence frames. These interview questions consisted of a mixture of semi-structured and open-ended types of questions. I chose these types because they afforded me the freedom of following up my participants' responses with more questions. These responses were audio recorded, and then they were transcribed and entered into password-protected digital document. Now for data analysis. For quantitative data, I utilized the paired t-test to compare the mean for both assessments. I also compared participants' percentage scores individually. To run the paired t-test, I used a software program, and I used Excel to graph data comparisons. For qualitative data, I searched for common patterns, themes, and contradictions within my observation notes and my participant interview transcriptions. For instance, for my interview transcriptions, I used line-by-line coding to find phrase patterns, then I color-coded these patterns to help me categorize them into broader themes. I then looked for ways that these themes and contradictions were relative to answering my research question. I utilized Microsoft Word to transcribe and color-code the data. Now let's look at the results of the quantitative data. This bar graph displays the comparison of the two assessments. On the left in blue is assessment 1, which did not contain sentence frames as a support. On the right in orange is assessment 2, which did contain the sentence frames. There were only 3 students that scored lower on assessment 2. There was 1 student who performed the same on both assessments. So then I looked at a comparison of individual test performance, and the main points from that are that 8 out of 12 participants did score higher on the test with the sentence frame format. 3 out of 12 participants scored higher without this format as a modification, and 1 out of 12 participants scored equally on both tests. And here are the calculations for the paired t-test. At the top, you'll see the scores for each test, and what my findings were for this test is that the means of group 1 and group 2 were not significantly different. Although when you look at the mean for test 1 and compared to the mean for test 2, which did contain the sentence frames as a support for the participants, did have a higher mean value than test 1. And then here we're looking at a graph of the actual means. Test 1 came in at 56.4, test 2 at 69.6. And now we'll look at the qualitative data. These are the interview questions that the participants participated in. Question 1 asked them which assessment they felt was easier, the one with the sentence frames or the one without the sentence frames. Question 2 and 3 asked them how they were feeling and what they were thinking as they took each assessment. And then question 4 asked the participant if they were given a choice, which type of assessment would they choose. And then to look at the interview highlights, 7 out of 12 participants thought answering reading questions was easier within the sentence frame format. 5 out of 12 participants thought answering the questions was easier without those frames. And so that was rather close. And if given the choice of how they would answer reading questions, it was actually split down the middle. 6 out of 12 chose to answer within the sentence frame format, and 6 out of 12 chose to answer independently without the frames. And these are highlights, actual quotes from the participants themselves of their perceptions. It felt easy because, like I don't have to write the whole sentence. Another participant said, if you fill in the blanks, it's more easier, or you can just copy the words from the story and put them in there. This participant said, the one I filled in by myself was the easiest. It was easy when I did it alone, and it was hard when there was one word at the beginning and 2 lines at the beginning, and then they tell you the rest. And another participant said, I could understand it more than writing sentences. And now quotes from participants on their preference for how to answer reading questions. This first participant on the left top says, all by myself, because it could be like a challenge or kind of like productive struggle. So they chose to write without the sentence frames. Another participant said that they would prefer to write it in the lines. I don't like it without the lines because I don't know how to write the sentence. And then another one said, all by myself, it helps me become a good writer. And then another participant said, if you fill in the blanks, it's more easier, or you can just copy the words from the story and put them in there. For my observations, I didn't discover any patterns or themes that actually connected to my research question, although I did observe the participants using some patterns in learning strategies. Those patterns were using self-talk and referring to text when seeking answers to their reading comprehension questions. And now on to my findings. For the quantitative data, individually, there were 5 out of 12 more participants that scored higher on the test, for which they had sentence frames as a modification. The mean scores were slightly more for the tests that utilized the sentence frames. And as for the PAIR-T test, it found that no significant difference in overall scores of both tests existed. And for the qualitative data, there were 2 more participants who responded that answering the questions was easier within the sentence frame format versus those who did not agree. The participants were equally divided regarding their preference as to which format they would choose. I found it interesting that even though more participants thought it easier to answer reading questions within the sentence frame format, they were equally divided about whether or not they would choose to answer questions in this way. Some reasons that they gave that I did find very enlightening were that because they wanted to be challenged, or they wanted to be a better writer, or they wanted to participate in productive struggle. And then I did find some conflicts between the interview responses and the assessment performance. And one of those was that 3 participants that responded that answering questions was easier without the sentence frames. These 3 participants had performed better with the frames on the assessment. And then there was 1 participant, on the other hand, that responded that answering questions was easier with the sentence frames, but they had performed better on their assessment, the one without the frames. So those were interesting conflicts to look at. This sample only consisted of 2 comparison assessments. I think more research is needed so that a larger sample can be analyzed. It's critical for English learners to have effective modifications if they are to make ample progress in language and in academics. Due to the outcome of the PAIR-T test, my conclusion is that the sentence frame modification did not have a significant effect on elementary EL's abilities to correctly answer reading comprehension questions. The mean score for the tests which utilized the frames was slightly higher than was the mean for the other test. 8 out of 12 participants performed better on the tests that utilized the frames. 7 out of 12 participants responded that they felt answering questions with the support of the frames was easier than not having that support. Half of participants stated if given the choice, they would answer reading questions by completing the sentence frames. These findings are important as they show indication that sentence frames as a writing modification should be examined further. I can personally implement them as a writing modification for my students, and I can also recommend that my co-teachers use them in various contents that they teach. This will provide more knowledge about their effectiveness.